How to Read and Understand the Biblical Prophets by Peter J. Gentry, Chapter 5, Describing the Future, Part 1. Typology and the New Exodus. The Israelite prophet usually called his experience a vision. Nonetheless, the expression may apply to the experience on any or all of his five senses. See Isaiah 21:3. His prophetic experiences gives him access to the heavenly court where Yahweh is enthroned. The nature of Hebrew prophecy. In a number of places in the Bible, we are given a glimpse of the court of heaven, where God is surrounded by angels or the heavenly host, who are called in the earlier parts of the Old Testament sons of God, or simply gods. One example occurs in the book of Job. Job 1:6 states that there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the adversary, the Satan, also came among them. Another example is found in Psalm 82, which begins with the words, God has taken his place in the divine assembly. He gives judgment among the gods. In 1 Kings 22:19, when the king of Judah and the king of Israel are seeking the divine will about whether to join together in an attack upon the Arameans, we see that the prophet Micah has access to the assembly of the court of heaven, where God announces his decisions. In verse 19, we read, Micaiah continued, Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the host of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. Isaiah, too, as a prophet, has access to the divine assembly, and here he announces a court case between God and the nations. So the prophet hears and sees the divine decisions that concern the governing of particular individuals, nations, or situations. The prophet does not necessarily understand all he is reporting, yet with broad strokes the prophet paints a panoramic picture in which the near and distant futures of his vision are set side by side. The near and distant future in Isaiah 7-11. Chart 5.1 contains the sequence of visions from Isaiah 7:1 through 11:6. An N marks the visions as applying to the immediate or near future, and F indicates a prediction of the distant or far future. This illustrates in a simple way how predictions of far and near future are placed side by side as Isaiah's prophecy zigzags back and forth in terms of time. Chart 5.1. 3. The Emmanuel cycle 7:1 through 8:18. N. A. The threat to the Davidic house 7:1 through 9. 1. Conspiracy against the Davidic house 7:1 through 2. 2. Response of the prophet 7:3 through 6. 3. The conspiracy will fail 7:7 through 9. B. Oracle concerning Emmanuel 7:10 through 25. F. 1. Birth of Emmanuel, difficult future 7:10 through 17. N. 2. Invasion of Egyptians and Assyrians 7:18 through 20. N. 3. Famine in Judah 7:21 through 22. N. 4. Desolation in Judah 7:23 through 25. N. C. Oracle concerning Maher Shalal Hashbaz 8:1 through 4. N. B. Second mention of Emmanuel 8:5 through 10. 1. Rising River Invasion of Assyrians 8:5 through 8. 2. The anti-Assyrian coalition plot foiled 8:9 through 10. N. C. Second mention of Maher Shalal Hashbaz 8:11 through 22. 1. Oracle, put your trust in Yahweh 8:11 through 15. 2. Response, Isaiah and sons signs for Israel 8:16 through 18. 4. The cycle of El Gabor, 8:19 through 10:19. A. Introduction, 8:19 through 22. 1. Oracle, only Yahweh knows the future, 8:19. 2. Response, no hope apart from trusting God's word, 8:20. 3. Comment, despair of those who rely on themselves, 8:21 through 22. F. B. The promise of El Gabor, 9:1 through 7. N. C. Judgment upon Israel, 9:8 through 10:4. 1. Foreign invasion, 9:8 through 12. 2. Corrupt society, 9:13 through 17. C. Anarchy, 9:18 through 21. 4. Exile, 10:1 through 4. N. D. Divine use of and judgment upon Assyria, 10:5 through 19. 1. Assyria's plans and the Lord's plans, 10:5 through 11. 2. Assyria's pride evaluated by her and the Lord, 10:12 through 15. 3. Divine judgment upon Assyria, 10:16 through 19. 5. The cycle of the remnant, deliverance from Assyria, future salvation of Judah, 10:20 through 11:16. N.F. 1. Deliverance for a remnant, 10:20 through 26. A. A remnant will rely on the Lord, 10:20 through 23. B. Deliverance for the remnant, 10:24 through 26. 2. Fall of Assyrian tree and rise of Davidic, 10:27 through 11:9. N. A. Assyria will be judged, 10:27 through 34. 1. Deliverance of Judah from Assyrian attack, 10:27 through 32. 2. The Lord lops off, cuts down the forest, 10:33 through 34. F. B. Rebirth of the Davidic tree, 11:1 through 16. 1. Reign of a future king, 11:1 through 9. 2. Nations recognize the Davidic monarch, 11:10. 3. Future restoration of Israel, return of exiles, 11:11 through 16. We saw earlier from Deuteronomy 18 that a prophet was affirmed when his prophecies came true. For that reason, he would place his predictions concerning the near future next to his predictions for the distant future, so that when the more immediate predictions came to pass, his hearers would be encouraged or instructed by his predictions concerning the distant future. This point alone is responsible for the fact that books such as Isaiah, Daniel, and Zechariah are divided into a part dealing with contemporary issues and a part dealing with the distant future. To deny authorship of the second part of the prophet, of the first part, is to misunderstand the function and nature of Hebrew prophecy, as well as the literary structure and unity of these works. The manner in which the prophet speaks of the future is determined by both the purpose of the prophecy in question and the features that constrain communication in the human world. Broadly speaking, there are 3 ways in which descriptions of events in the future can be made. 1. Literal, plain speech, no metaphors, symbols, or types. 2. Apocalyptic language, which makes heavy use of metaphors and symbols. And 3. Types. Each of these 3 ways of communicating fulfills different functions in the literary setting in which it is found. The main focus of this chapter is to deal with the notion of types and typology. Typology: events, people, and places in the past that become a model or pattern for events, people, and places in the future. Typology. Perhaps it might be helpful to illustrate typology and then, afterward, define it more precisely. A major type in the Bible, in both Old and New Testaments, is the Exodus, when God delivered his people Israel from bondage and slavery in Egypt. Here, an event in the past becomes a model or pattern to describe future deliverance and salvation for the people of God. let us explore the way in which the prophets in general, and Isaiah in particular, use the language of God's great act of deliverance in Israel's past to announce and describe the future deliverance from exile. Especially constructive and helpful is an essay by Bernard W. Anderson entitled Exodus Typology in 2nd Isaiah. Anderson's title is based on his belief that Isaiah 40 through 66 are chapters written after the time of the 8th century prophet known as Isaiah. Here, his presuppositions lead him astray, for Exodus typology is found equally in Isaiah 1 through 39. Anderson's interpretation better suits an approach that takes the book as a unity written by Isaiah than an approach that does not. Anderson identifies 4 separate stages to the event of the Exodus. Language alluding to each of these 4 stages is employed by Isaiah to describe the future deliverance and rescue of Israel. These 4 stages are as follows. 1. The promise to the fathers. 2. The deliverance from Egypt. 3. The journey through the wilderness. 4. The re-entry into the promised land. We will briefly describe the basis in the Pentateuch, or the Torah, for each of these 4 stages, and then illustrate from the book of Isaiah how the prophet employs the imagery and language of that particular stage to describe the future salvation. First, the promises to the father. Here, the term fathers refers to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the nation's forefathers and patriarchs. The Exodus was predicted 400 years prior to the event, when God made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15:12 through 16. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. In Genesis 12, 15, and 17, and 22, God promises descendants and land to the fathers. These promises are repeated in Isaiah, but this time with reference to the return of the exiles from Babylon. Surely your waste and your desolate places and your devastated land, surely now you will be too narrow for your inhabitants, and those who swallowed you up will be far away. The children of your bereavement will yet say in your ears, The place is too narrow for me, make room for me to dwell in. Then you will say in your heart, Who has borne me these? I was bereaved and barren, exiled and put away, but who has brought up these? Behold, I was left alone. From where have these come? Isaiah 49:19 through 21, ESV. Sing, O barren one who did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent, and let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out. Do not hold back, lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes, for you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your offspring will possess the nations, and will people the desolate cities. Isaiah 54:1 through 3, ESV. When the exiles return from Babylon, they will have family members they don't recognize, and they will have more land because the Gentiles, the nations, will be included in the tent of Abraham. So Isaiah employs language from the promises to the ancestors of Israel and applies them to the coming salvation. There is a difference, however. The new Exodus will be bigger and better. It will involve more land and seed than just ethnic Israel. The second stage of the Exodus event is the deliverance from Egypt, which involved the plagues upon the gods of Egypt, the exit from Egypt, and the crossing of the Red Sea. Language from this part of the Exodus is also used by Isaiah to describe the coming rescue of Israel from exile in Babylon and exile in a broken relationship with Yahweh, i.e., slavery to sin. This second stage can be illustrated in many ways. A key phrase of the Exodus is that Yahweh delivered his people with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, Deuteronomy 4:34. The arm is applied by Isaiah to the coming salvation, especially Isaiah 40:10, 48:14, 51:5 and 9, 52:12, 53:1. During the Exodus, by means of a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, Yahweh went before his people and was also a rear guard. We see these terms applied to the coming salvation in Isaiah 4:5 and 52:12. In the song at the sea celebrating the Exodus in Exodus 15, Yahweh is called a man of war, verse 3. The only other place where this phrase is applied to Yahweh is Isaiah 42:13, concerning the new Exodus. In fact, Isaiah speaks of a new song in 42:10. What is the new song? To answer this question, we must know what the old song is. The old song is Exodus 15. And the new song celebrates the victory of the king in the new Exodus. This idea goes right through to Revelation 5:9. The third stage of the Exodus is the journey through the desert, which should have taken just days, but took 40 years, Deuteronomy 1:2. In the Exodus, Yahweh led his people and showed them the way, Exodus 13:21. In the coming deliverance, a call is given to prepare the way of the Lord in the desert, Isaiah 40:3-5. Mark 1:1-3 identifies John the Baptist and Jesus as beginning to fulfill this part of the new Exodus. During the desert journey, God provided food, bread rained from the skies every day, and water, example from the rock, Exodus 17:2-7, Numbers 20:8. This imagery is also applied to the future salvation in Isaiah 41:17-20, 43:19-21, 48:21, and 49:10. As a matter of fact, the desert will eventually be transformed into a new Eden, Isaiah 35:6-7, 49:9-11, 55:13. The fourth and final stage of the Exodus is the entrance into the promised land described in the book of Joshua. Note Isaiah 49:8-11. Thus says the Lord, in a time of favor I have answered you. In a day of salvation I have helped you. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people to establish the land, to apportion the desolate heritages, saying to the prisoners, come out. To those who are in darkness, appear. They shall feed along the ways. On all bare heights shall be their pasture. They shall not hunger or thirst, neither scorching wind nor sun shall strike them. For he who has pity on them will lead them, and by springs of water will guide them. And I will make all my mountains a road, and my highways shall be raised up. ESV. This section is full of images from the Exodus. Note in particular the end of verse 8. To apportion the desolate heritages. This is a direct allusion to Joshua 15-19, the section describing Joshua apportioning the land of Canaan to the tribes according to their clans. Paul uses precisely this language in Colossians 1:12 to speak of the work of Jesus Christ in bringing about the new Exodus. Anderson lists a number of passages in Isaiah where the coming rescue from exile in Babylon and in sin uses the language of God's great redemption in the past. Chart 5.2. Passages in Isaiah where new Exodus is the theme. 1:43-5, the highway in the wilderness. 2:41:17-20, the transformation of the wilderness. 3:42:14-16, Yahweh leads his people in a way unknown. Passages in Isaiah where new Exodus is the theme. 4:43:1-3, passing through the waters and the fire. 5:43:14-21, away in the wilderness. 6, 48, 20 through 21, the Exodus from Babylon. 7, 49, 8 through 12, the new entry into the Promised Land. 8, 51, 9 through 10, the new victory at the sea. 9, 52, 11 through 12, the new Exodus. 10, 55, 12 through 13, Israel shall go out in joy and peace. Ezekiel and Jeremiah, as well as the other prophets, continue to use images and language from the Exodus to describe the coming king and his victory that brings not only physical release from Babylon, but spiritual rescue from slavery to sin and incorrigible covenant violation. But there is more to just using the Exodus as a model or pattern of future salvation. The antitype to which the type points, or the reality of which the model or pattern is only a shadow, or which it foreshadows, is always bigger and greater than the type. We shall briefly consider 3 examples. Depart, depart, go out from there. Touch no unclean thing. Go out from the midst of her. Purify yourselves, you who bear the vessels of the Lord. For you shall not go out in haste, and you shall not go in flight. For the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your rear guard. Isaiah 52, 11 through 12, ESV. This is another section where Yahweh describes bringing the exiles home using the language of the exit from Egypt. Notice that verse 12 says, "You shall not go out in haste." The Hebrew word used for haste, hepazon, occurs only 3 times in the entire Old Testament: Exodus 12:11, Deuteronomy 16:3, and Isaiah 52:12. The occurrences in Exodus and Deuteronomy describe the exodus from Egypt. They went out in a hurry. They didn't have time to plan for the journey or pack properly. They just grabbed their stuff and took off. In the new Exodus, however, they will not go out in haste. They will be given time to slowly saunter out. This was true of the physical release from Babylon. There were a couple of groups that departed at different times. It is also true of the new Exodus brought about by Jesus Christ. The period between his first coming and his second coming constitutes the time for bringing the exiles home, and the generosity and kindness of God are displayed in providing lots of time for his people to return to him. The claim that the period between Jesus' first and second coming is the return from exile, i.e. slavery to sin and broken covenant relationship with God, requires proof. Note first Jeremiah 16, 14 through 16. "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when it shall no longer be said, As the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as the Lord lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the north country, and out of all the countries where he had driven them. For I will bring them back to their own land that I gave to their fathers. Behold, I am sending for my many fishers, declares the Lord, and they shall catch them, and afterward I shall send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill, and out of the clefts of the rocks." ESV. In verses 14 through 16, Jeremiah describes the return from Babylon, i.e. the north country, in plain speech. There are no figures of speech or metaphors in these verses. He does compare this deliverance to the Exodus, and he does say the event will be much bigger and better than the Exodus. God's people will swear not by the God of the Exodus, but by the one who brought out the new Exodus. Then, in verse 16, Jeremiah describes bringing the exiles home in terms of hunting and fishing. He will send out fishermen to bring the exiles home. So, in Luke 5:10, when Jesus calls his followers and says he will make them fishers of men, it is a direct reference to Jeremiah 16. Jesus is saying, metaphorically, I have come to bring the exiles home, and I am sending you men to begin this job. Another important message is Isaiah 27:12 through 13. "In that day, from the river Euphrates to the brook of Egypt, the Lord will thresh out the grain, and you will be gleaned one by one, O people of Israel. And in that day a great trumpet will be blown, and those who were lost in the land of Assyria, and those who were driven out to the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord on the holy mountain at Jerusalem. ESV. This is another passage that describes bringing the exiles home, which here is compared to a harvest. The event is announced by the blowing of a trumpet, a signal in the Old Testament that usually announces the coming of a new king to rule. So, in 1 Thessalonians 4, when Paul says that the return of Jesus Christ will be announced by the blowing of the trumpet of God, he is referring directly to Isaiah 27 and telling his readers that this signal that announces the coming of the king is also part of bringing the exiles home. Thus, we learn that the period between Jesus' first and second comings is the time for the exiles to come home. Another passage is Isaiah 2:2-4. It shall come to pass in the later days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. ESV. In this section, Isaiah sees in a vision a picture of the future Zion. He sees it as a mountain higher than any other. In verse 3, all nations are coming to this mountain to receive instruction, Torah, from the Lord. This image is based on the Exodus when Israel came to Mount Sinai and God gave the Torah to Israel. Only here in Isaiah 2 and in Micah 4:1-3, Zion has replaced Sinai, and all the nations are coming to Zion to receive Torah. This implies a new covenant that includes the nations, since the word Torah always refers to the instruction or stipulations given in a covenant relationship. So here is another case where the new Exodus has a much greater scope than the original one. Isaiah 4 also presents a vision of the future, renewed and transformed Zion. In that day, the growth from Yahweh will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and honor of the survivors of Israel, and he who is left in Zion and survives in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem, when the Lord shall have washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion, and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst, by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning. Then the Lord will create over the whole site of Mount Zion, and over her assemblies, a cloud by day, and smoke and the shining of a flaming fire by night. For the glory will be a canopy over all. There will be a booth for shade by day from the heat, and for a refuge, and a shelter from the storm and rain. Verses 2-6. Clearly, the mention of a cloud of smoke by day and the pillar of fire by night reminds the reader of the journey through the wilderness. When the tent or worship or tabernacle was constructed, the bright cloud that represented the glory of Yahweh settled on it. Here, however, the cloud by day and pillar by night is over all the city, and the glory is a canopy over all of Zion. This is telling us that the entire city is a temple or place of worship. God's glory and presence are everywhere. So the new Exodus is much grander than the original one. One final illustration is necessary to demonstrate the interpretive principle under discussion, and that is Isaiah 11:11-16. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal to the nations, and will assemble the banished of Israel, and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. The jealousy of Ephraim shall depart, and those who harass Judah shall be cut off. Ephraim shall not be jealous of Judah, and Judah shall not harass Ephraim. But they shall swoop down on the shoulder of the Philistines in the west, and together they shall plunder the people of the east. They shall put out their hand against Edom and Moab, and the Ammonites shall obey them. And the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and will wave his hand over the river with his scorching breath, and strike it into 7 channels, and he will lead people across in sandals, and there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant that remains of his people, as there was for Israel when they came up from the land of Egypt. ESV. According to verse 11, this section is describing Yahweh bringing the exiles or the remnant of his people home. Note the fact that it begins with the words, "The Lord will extend his hand yet a second time." The phrase, "extend his hand," immediately reminds us of the Exodus, and the phrase, "a second time," tells us that Isaiah is speaking of a future salvation as a new or second Exodus. In verse 15, we see that Yahweh will destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt and wave his hand over the river, i.e., the Euphrates. The Euphrates will be struck into 7 channels, and the people will cross in sandals. I want to ask a question bluntly. Is Isaiah describing the event literally? Will the Red Sea be dried up and the Euphrates divided into 7 channels? This did not happen for Ezra and Nehemiah in the physical return from Babylon. No, according to the interpretive principle of using images and the language of God's deliverance in the past to describe a coming salvation, we form in our minds only the idea that no obstacles will stand in God's way when he gathers the remnant of his people. This is what the rules of Hebrew literature require at this point. It is not a matter of defending a literal hermeneutic. It is a matter of discerning the method of communication used by the prophets and using that method to discern their intended meaning. The literal meaning is the meaning as determined by the rules of the particular genre or kind of literature. The basis for the Exodus as a type. To deepen our understanding, we need to ask the question, why did the biblical prophets employ the event of the Exodus as a type of future salvation? To answer, we need to briefly look at Exodus 15, the song at the sea. This is the song sung by Moses and the people to celebrate deliverance from the army of Egyptians chasing them. Exodus 15:1. Apparently, Miriam, the sister of Moses, who is called a prophetess, led the people in singing this song, verses 20 through 21. The poem, or song in Exodus 15:1 through 18, is divided into 4 stanzas and arranged for antiphonal singing, a type of singing that probably requires a brief explanation. Many ancient churches or cathedrals in England and Europe are built in the shape of a cross, as in diagram 5.1. The altar and the screen are at the top of the cross. The people sit in the area below the crossbar. The letters A and B represent the area where the choir sits. The choir is divided into 2 halves. In some singing, parts A and B are sung together. It is also possible for the A half to sing a line or 2, and then for the B part to answer with a line or 2. The 2 halves of the choir are singing to each other. This is called antiphonal singing. Norbert Lofink has shown, chart 5.3, that the 4 stanzas of the song in Exodus 15 constitute antiphonal singing. Chart 5.3. Literary structure of Exodus 15. A. Praising choir, verses 1 through 7. B. Narrative choir, verses 8 through 10. C. Praising choir, verse 11. B. Narrative choir, verses 12 through 17. The choir is divided in half. See Nehemiah 12 for an example of this kind of singing. One half is focused on praise. The other half is focused on telling the story. With this structure in mind, let us focus on the 2nd and 4th stanzas, which relate the story of the Exodus. First, consider stanza 2. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, my hand shall destroy them. You blew with your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Verses 8 through 10, ESV. Note the structure of these verses in Chart 5.4. Chart 5.4, B, Narrative Choir, verses 8 through 10. Verse 8, Breath of Yahweh, C. Verse 9, Enemies pursued. Verse 10, Breath of Yahweh, C. The agent of all actions or verbs in verses 8 and 10 is Yahweh. In between verses 8 and 10, we have verse 9, where the agent of all actions or verbs is the enemy pursuing Israel. The repeated I will clearly emphasizes this. The literary and poetic structure actually gives us a picture of the event. Verses 8 and 10 are like the wall of water on the left and on the right. Verse 9 is the enemy in the middle as they pursue Israel. The watery walls close in on them and they drown. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Now let us consider the fourth stanza sung also by the narrative choir in verses 12 through 17. You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. You have guided them by your strength to your holy abode. The peoples have heard, they tremble. Pangs have seized the inhabitants of Philistia. Now are the chiefs of Edom dismayed. Trembling seizes the leader of Moab. All the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. Terror and dread fall upon them. Because of the greatness of your arm, they are still as stone. Till your people, O Lord, pass by, till the people pass by whom you have purchased, you will bring them in and plant them on your own mountain, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your abode. The sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. ESV. The literary and poetic structure of the fourth stanza is the same as that for the second, as shown in Chart 5.5. Chart 5.5, D, Narrative Choir, verses 12 through 17. Verses 12 through 13, Yahweh leads into New Eden. Verses 14 through 16, Avenue of Sphinxes. Verse 17, Yahweh leads into New Eden. This fourth stanza of the narrative choir tells of the journey through the desert to Canaan. Israel must pass between nations hostile to them. Instead of Israel dreading these enemies, Yahweh places a great dread upon the enemies, so that they are still and silent as sphinxes, afraid of the Israelites. In the first and third strophes of the stanza, using the word strophe is a subsection of a stanza. Yahweh is the agent, and he is leading his people to a new Eden. Notice in verse 17 how Canaan is described as a mountain sanctuary, the home of Yahweh. This language comes from the Garden of Eden, which was on a mountain. See Ezekiel 28. And the strophe between these two is the Avenue of the Sphinxes, as Norbert Loefink calls it. Israel ought to be in dread of these monster enemies, but they are silent, gripped by dread and fear placed upon them by Yahweh. Once again, note the ABA pattern. Yahweh is the agent on either side, just like the wall of water is the Exodus, with the enemy in the middle destroyed by dread. The main point is this. Exodus 15 was a song sung at the Red Sea, but verses 12 through 17 describe a future salvation. Deliverance from the enemy nations as God's people pass by them on the journey through the desert is still future at this point in time. Yet the wall of water on the left and on the right is a picture of how God will save them. In other words, the Exodus is a model or pattern of future salvation from the very beginning. The first time they sang this song, they were using the crossing of the Red Sea as a model or pattern of how God would bring them successfully through the desert to Canaan. Since Isaiah and the prophets understood Exodus 15 in this way, they realized that the Exodus was intended to be used as a model or pattern or type of future salvation. Principles of typology. We are now in a position to lay out the principles of typology and the factors that determine correct interpretation. What is a type and what is not a type? In brief, typology is governed by 4 factors. The first is correspondence between events, people, places, etc. of one time and events, people, places, etc. of a later time. This correspondence is due to the fact that God in his providence sovereignly controls history, and he is consistent in his character so that there are repetitive patterns to his works in history. Second is escalatant, from type to antitype, so that the later event, person, or thing that can be said to be the fulfillment of the type is much better and greater than that which foreshadows it. Third is biblical warrant. For something to be considered a type, there must be exegetical evidence in the original text that indicates that what the text is dealing with is intended to be a model or pattern for something to follow in history. As we just considered, deliverance through the Red Sea was intended from the start to be a model for future salvation. Thus, when the major prophets predict a future salvation through the work of a coming king, they are right to speak of it as a new Exodus and describe the coming salvation in the language of God's great deliverance in the past. They are right because they have correctly understood Exodus 15. The fourth factor is that the progression of the covenants throughout the narrative plot structure of the Bible creates, controls, and develops the typology structures across the canon of the Scripture. For example, in the covenant with creation, Adam is portrayed as a king-priest who must be an obedient son in relation to God, and a servant king in relation to creation. This role is taken up by Noah in the covenant with God that reaffirms the covenant with creation. Next, in the covenant with Abraham, the king-priest role devolves upon him. In Exodus 19, we see how Israel as a nation is called to be an obedient son and servant king, functioning in a priestly role in relation to the nations of the world. In the Davidic covenant, this role is narrowed from the nation as a whole to the king in particular. Finally, in the new covenant, Jesus the Messiah fulfills these roles adequately and fully.